7 months after Washington forced one of the most dramatic changes in Venezuela's political and energy landscape in decades, Venezuelan crude is flowing back to the United States at a pace not seen since the sanctions era began. In July, Venezuela shipped roughly 786,000 barrels of oil per day to the United States, up from only 284,000 barrels per day in January and the highest level since early 2019. The reversal is especially striking because the United States spent years trying to isolate Venezuela's state oil industry. Now American refiners are once again becoming some of its most important customers. That does not mean Washington simply abandoned sanctions and returned to the old relationship. The system emerging in 2026 is much more controlled. U.S. authorities have created licenses determining which companies can trade Venezuelan crude, which services can support production, where certain payments must go, and which foreign-linked ventures remain outside the permitted network. What looks like sanctions relief is therefore becoming something closer to sanctions engineering. Washington is using access to the American market not merely to block Venezuelan oil, but increasingly to influence how that oil is produced, financed, and sold. The numbers show how quickly the destination of Venezuela's barrels has changed. Total Venezuelan exports actually slipped in July to about 1.16 million barrels per day from 1.2 million in June, marking a second monthly decline after exports reached approximately 1.24 million barrels per day in May. Yet, shipments to the United States continued rising even as the overall total fell. Exports to India dropped to around 178,000 barrels per day, while shipments to Europe declined to roughly 82,200 barrels per day. The headline is therefore not simply that Venezuela is exporting more oil. It is that America is absorbing an increasingly large share of what Venezuela is able to sell. That reversal began in January after U.S. forces removed Nicolas Maduro from power and Delcy Rodriguez became interim president. Within days, Washington announced an agreement giving the United States access to as much as $2 billion worth of Venezuelan crude. PDVSA said at the time that any transactions would have to occur on commercial terms and at international prices, pushing back against suggestions that Venezuelan oil would simply be handed over to Washington. Chevron was initially the only company already operating with a U.S. authorization broad enough to keep exporting Venezuelan crude to American refiners. The political transition remains unresolved. Rodriguez's interim government is operating while Washington-backed talks attempt to reshape Venezuela's institutions and eventually move the country toward elections. A bipartisan group of U.S. senators has recently pressed for a clearer electoral timetable, illustrating the tension between Washington's growing economic involvement and the unfinished political transition. The oil industry is therefore expanding inside a system whose long-term political rules have not yet been settled. For oil companies, however, the geography creates a powerful reason to move quickly. Venezuela and the U.S. Gulf Coast are unusually natural trading partners. Venezuela produces large quantities of dense, high-sulfur crude, while many complex refineries along the Gulf Coast were built or modified specifically to process heavy sour barrels from countries such as Venezuela and Mexico. These refineries contain cokers, hydrotreaters, and other expensive equipment capable of turning difficult crude into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other higher value products. America's shale revolution never eliminated that requirement. Much of the oil produced from U.S. shale formations is relatively light, meaning it does not perfectly replace the heavy crude for which some Gulf Coast refineries were designed. Refiners can alter their feedstock mix, and Canada has become an enormous supplier of heavy barrels, but access to Venezuela restores another familiar source, only a relatively short tanker voyage away. Before broad U.S. sanctions took effect in 2019, this relationship was routine. U.S. imports of Venezuelan crude averaged roughly 510,000 barrels per day in 2018 after having exceeded 1 million barrels per day during earlier periods. Sanctions then nearly severed that trade. Chevron was eventually allowed to resume limited exports from its joint ventures in 2023, but the relationship remained a fraction of its historical scale. July's 786,000 barrel per day figure therefore represents more than a statistical rebound. It marks the reconstruction of a physical trade route that American refiners once considered a normal part of their supply system. Chevron remains central to that recovery. The company exported approximately 293,000 barrels per day from Venezuela in July, broadly unchanged from June. But the larger transformation is the arrival of trading houses and other authorized participants. Vitol, Trafigura, and Novum Energy together ship roughly 604,000 barrels per day of Venezuelan oil during July across authorized destinations, while PDVSA has also resumed direct deliveries to European partners, including Repsol, to settle outstanding obligations. Washington has deliberately created room for this broader commercial network. Treasury's General License Framework now authorizes activities that would have been prohibited under the underlying Venezuela sanctions regulations. Certain licenses permit the lifting, sale, transportation, storage, and refining of Venezuelan oil. Others allow U.S. companies to supply equipment, software, technology, insurance, and services needed for Venezuelan oil and gas operations. Authorized entities can even participate in new investment and development under defined conditions. That is a profound shift from simply allowing individual cargoes to leave Venezuela. An oil industry cannot recover merely because someone is willing to buy crude. Wells require maintenance. Pumps fail. Pipelines corrode. Reservoirs need technical analysis. Drilling requires equipment and specialized services. Tankers require insurance. Terminals need functioning infrastructure, and heavy crude must often be blended before it can move efficiently through pipelines or onto ships. Venezuela's problem is especially difficult because years of underinvestment and operational deterioration damaged an industry that once produced more than 3 million barrels per day. Sanctions intensified the isolation, but the decline began before the strongest U.S. restrictions took effect. Reopening market access can increase exports relatively quickly when inventories exist, yet rebuilding sustainable production requires far more capital and time. The difference is visible in this year's data. Venezuelan exports peaked at roughly 1.24 million barrels per day in May, partly because PDVSA was draining crude stored both onshore and aboard vessels. Exports then declined in June and July as less inventory was available for release. That means the current flow should not automatically be interpreted as evidence that Venezuela has already rebuilt production capacity. Some of the rapid export recovery has come from moving oil that was already produced. This is the first major constraint on Washington's apparent success. The United States can reopen a commercial route faster than Venezuela can repair an entire petroleum industry. Companies considering billions of dollars of investment therefore have to separate the size of Venezuela's resource base from the condition of its infrastructure. Venezuela possesses the world's largest officially reported proven crude reserves, but much of that resource consists of heavy oil requiring substantial investment, dilution, upgrading, and specialized refining. Huge reserves create potential. They do not automatically create deliverable barrels. The January discussions with American oil executives exposed that difference. Trump predicted that U.S. oil companies could invest at least $100 billion rebuilding Venezuela's industry. But executives and investors were considerably more cautious. Companies had to consider political stability, contractual protection, historical nationalizations, infrastructure condition, and whether future Venezuelan governments would honor agreements negotiated during the current transition. For Chevron, the calculation is easier because the company never fully left Venezuela and already operates joint ventures there. For a company contemplating a major new project, the risk is very different. A new development could require billions of dollars before producing its first commercial barrel, while Venezuela's political institutions are still being renegotiated. That creates an unusual sequencing problem. Washington wants investment quickly because higher production could stabilize the Venezuelan economy, increase supplies available to U.S. refiners, and reduce the influence of rival powers. Investors, however, want political and legal stability before committing capital. Venezuela may need oil investment to create the economic stability that investors themselves are waiting to see. Treasury's licensing architecture attempts to bridge part of that gap by defining what companies are legally permitted to do. General licenses now authorize selected companies to explore potential projects, provide equipment and services, conduct due diligence, and participate in authorized oil operations. But those permissions also contain restrictions intended to keep Washington in control of how the reopening develops. The most revealing restriction involves money. Under several U.S. authorizations, monetary payments that would otherwise go directly to blocked Venezuelan government entities, or PDVSA, must instead be deposited into foreign government deposit funds or another account designated by the U.S. Treasury. Routine local taxes and permits can be treated differently, but royalties and other covered payments are subject to the controlled payment framework. Treasury guidance updated in July makes clear that companies must provide detailed transaction information before deposits into those accounts are accepted. This means Washington has not simply removed itself from Venezuela's oil economy. It has moved closer to the transaction. Under the old sanctions model, the objective was largely to prevent revenue from reaching PDVSA and the Venezuelan government. Under the emerging framework, Washington is allowing more activity while placing conditions around the financial channel through which some proceeds move. That creates leverage at several levels. The United States can decide which transactions qualify for licenses. It can expand or narrow the list of authorized companies. It can regulate how payments involving blocked entities are handled. And because companies need confidence that licenses will remain valid, Washington retains significant influence even without banning Venezuelan oil outright. This is why describing the policy as simple sanctions relief misses the structural change. Sanctions are becoming a mechanism for selecting flows rather than eliminating them. The rules also reveal Washington's geopolitical priorities. Treasury guidance for certain oil-related activities places restrictions on transactions involving ventures tied to Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and China. The objective is not merely to increase Venezuelan production, it is to encourage a production and investment network that fits inside a US-approved commercial system. That has significant implications for China. For years, China became one of the most important destinations for Venezuelan crude when US sanctions shut much of the oil out of its traditional American market. Some Venezuelan shipments were also connected to earlier oil for loans arrangements created after Chinese institutions lent tens of billions of dollars to Caracas. The reopening of the US market gives PDVSA another large buyer much closer to home, while Washington's licensing restrictions can make some China-linked transactions more difficult than US-approved alternatives. It would be too strong to conclude that China has been removed from Venezuela's energy system, but the relative commercial leverage is clearly changing. The same is true for India and Europe. July's shipping data showed Venezuelan exports to both markets falling while shipments to America rose. That movement may reflect individual trading decisions, refinery economics, available cargoes, and temporary logistics rather than a permanent policy-driven diversion. But it demonstrates how reopening one major destination can immediately alter competition for a limited pool of barrels. The United States has one advantage those buyers cannot replicate: regulatory control. An Indian refinery can offer an attractive commercial price. A European company can negotiate a debt settlement. But Washington controls the licenses, determining whether many international companies, banks, insurers, and traders can interact with sanctioned Venezuelan entities without risking access to the American financial system. That transforms the US market from a buyer into a rule-setting platform. There is another hidden dependency deeper in Venezuela's supply chain. The country produces extremely heavy crude that often must be mixed with lighter hydrocarbons before it can be transported efficiently. In July, Venezuela imported approximately 81,000 barrels per day of heavy naphtha used to dilute its crude. The United States has specifically created licenses allowing sales of U.S. origin diluents to Venezuela. The trade relationship can therefore work in both directions. Venezuela sells heavy crude north to U.S. refiners. Lighter petroleum products, equipment, and services can move south to help Venezuela produce and transport more heavy oil. Additional diluent allows PDVSA to prepare more barrels for export, which can then return to the Gulf Coast as refinery feedstock. That cycle is commercially logical, but it also creates a new form of dependence. The more Venezuela's recovery relies on American diluents, oil field services, financial permissions, insurance, and buyers, the more Washington's influence extends beyond the simple act of purchasing crude. This helps explain why the current reopening looks so different from the relationship before 2019. Back then, Venezuela was an established supplier to the American refining system. Today, Washington is trying to reconstruct the trade while simultaneously restructuring the political and financial conditions around it. For U.S. refiners, the timing is unusually attractive. The Iran conflict has tightened global fuel markets and increased refining margins dramatically. Middle Eastern disruptions, damage to Russian refineries, and other supply constraints have pushed U.S. refiners to operate at extremely high utilization while exporting large volumes of diesel and other fuels. Phillips 66, Valero, Marathon, and other refiners have reported some of their strongest earnings since the energy disruption following Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. Additional Venezuelan heavy crude cannot solve a global refining shortage, but it gives Gulf Coast plants another feedstock option at a moment when every barrel compatible with their equipment becomes more valuable. This creates another reversal in American energy policy. The United States is the world's largest oil producer, yet it still benefits from importing crude. That sounds contradictory only if all crude oil is treated as interchangeable. A barrel of light West Texas Intermediate and a barrel of Venezuelan Miri do not behave identically inside a refinery. Complex Gulf Coast facilities were built to exploit different crude qualities, often buying cheaper, heavy sour barrels and converting them into valuable refined products. Domestic light crude can be exported while foreign heavy crude is imported at the same time without the two trades canceling each other out. Venezuela therefore fits into the U.S. refining system differently from America's shale fields. Geography strengthens the relationship. Venezuelan cargoes can reach Gulf Coast refineries without passing through the Strait of Hormuz, the Suez Canal, or other distant choke points. At a time when Middle Eastern shipping remains vulnerable and war risk costs have increased, supply from the Caribbean carries strategic value beyond the headline oil price. Yet the strongest counterargument to the optimistic case remains Venezuela itself. The oil industry is still damaged, political institutions remain unsettled. The current government is transitional. US-backed political talks have not produced a final electoral framework, and one of Venezuela's most prominent opposition leaders has been excluded from the current negotiations. An oil company committing capital today has to consider what the legal environment might look like under a future elected government. Washington's control is also not permanent. General licenses can be amended. Sanctions policy can change. A future U.S. administration could prefer either much broader normalization or renewed restrictions. Companies that base multi-billion-dollar projects entirely on today's political arrangement therefore face risks neither side can eliminate, and Venezuela's own interests may eventually diverge from Washington's. Caracas has every economic reason to regain as many customers as possible rather than become dependent on one buyer. India, Europe, and China all provide bargaining alternatives. If Venezuelan production increases substantially, the government will likely want competition among buyers to improve pricing and reduce vulnerability to any single foreign power. That means today's sharp shift toward the United States may not define the final structure of Venezuela's oil trade, but it is already changing the balance of leverage. In January, the U.S. was importing roughly 284,000 Venezuelan barrels per day. By July, the figure had reached approximately 786,000. In only half a year, a trade relationship that had been deliberately suppressed by sanctions returned close to the center of the Gulf Coast refining system. The speed tells us something important about commodity markets. Infrastructure can preserve relationships even when politics interrupts them. The pipelines, terminals, refineries, and technical configurations linking Venezuela to the U.S. Gulf Coast never disappeared simply because sanctions stopped many of the tankers. Once Washington reopened the legal channel, the underlying economics began pulling barrels north again. Rebuilding Venezuela's production system will be much slower. That is where the next stage of this story will be decided. If American and international companies invest enough to restore wells, pipelines, upgraders, and export infrastructure, Venezuela could eventually move far beyond simply releasing inventories and recovering old trade routes. More production would create more competition among buyers, more revenue for reconstruction, and potentially more heavy crude for U.S. refiners. If investment remains limited because political and legal risks are too high, the rebound could plateau. Washington would control an important oil corridor without producing the much larger supply increase Trump has suggested is possible. Either outcome would reveal something about the limits of economic pressure. Sanctions were powerful enough to redirect Venezuelan trade and contribute to isolating PDVSA from major Western markets. Removing and redesigning those restrictions has been powerful enough to send hundreds of thousands of barrels per day back toward America, but policy cannot manufacture petroleum infrastructure overnight. That requires engineers, equipment, capital, stable contracts, and years of work. For now, Washington has achieved the faster part. The U.S. market is open again to large volumes of Venezuelan crude. Chevron is shipping steadily. Trading houses have entered the system. Treasury licenses allow equipment and services to return, while control payment channels give Washington continued leverage over sanctioned entities. The result is neither the old sanctions regime nor a return to unrestricted trade. It is something new. America is using sanctions architecture to build a preferred oil network. Venezuelan crude can flow again but under conditions shaped in Washington. American refiners gain access to a nearby heavy crude they were designed to process. Venezuela regains a wealthy customer and a route toward investment. U.S. policymakers retain financial and regulatory tools capable of influencing who participates and where parts of the revenue move. The political measure can still change. The commercial relationships created underneath it may last much longer. 7 years after Venezuelan oil largely disappeared from American ports, the tankers are returning in force. The deeper shift is that Washington is no longer relying only on the power to stop those barrels. It is discovering the leverage that comes from deciding when, where, and under what conditions they can move.